Long story short, Nvidia tried to manipulate independent media by either threatening to deny access to interviews, as was claimed by Gamers Nexus, and by favouring media outlets giving positive feedback, such as in the case of the new entry-level GPUs called the 5060, where these favoured media outlets published raving pieces under strict rules placed by Nvidia. Turns out, those GPUs aren't as good as Nvidia wants you to believe, largely due to VRAM stagnation. But even if you're like, gaming, who has time for that nowadays, right? Well, GPUs aren't just used for games, and you should care that one of the world's largest companies, which is worth more than most countries' GDP, is trying to manipulate the media. Regardless of who Nvidia is targeting, fundamentally, it's about controlling a client's ability to get unbiased information. Consider this. Unlike the other companies like Microsoft or Google with similar market caps, Nvidia's dominance in its core business of AI chips only started relatively recently. So whatever controversies we see now are just a preview of how Nvidia wants to assert itself as AI becomes foundational to the global economy. Nvidia's objective here is pretty clear with their support of the scrapping of US export restrictions. Suppress non-American, which means non-Nvidia technologies, ensure that AI developers use Nvidia, and prevent competition. Geopolitical interests aside, any smartphone buyer who looked at Chinese options should already understand the innovation that comes without a monopoly. But anyway, let's elaborate on the media manipulation. Multiple independent media outlets, including Hardware Unboxed and TechSpot, have recently talked about Nvidia trying to control what they write and undermine reviews. Gamers Nexus called Nvidia's manipulation dirty, describing it as malignant poisoning of the press. Allegedly, for the 6 months before their video, Nvidia threatened to revoke their access to interview engineers if they did not produce reviews fitting Nvidia's narrative. These narratives include emphasizing unproven technologies like multi-frame generation to make less powerful GPUs seem better. For GPUs, more frames generally means more powerful, since they are processing more graphics on the screen, hence graphics processing units, GPUs. But because multi-frame generation, the new technology that Nvidia wants to push, uses AI to generate graphics, it doesn't necessarily reflect the real performance of the GPU. The frames won't necessarily look as the creators intended. And it would be misleading to compare a less powerful GPU using the tech to one not using it. In their video, Gamers Nexus also clarified that for interviews with Nvidia engineers, they do not receive money from Nvidia. And instead, Gamers Nexus spent tens of thousands of dollars in travel fees to go to Nvidia. They also pointed out that their reviews gave credit to the technical merits of Nvidia's products, such as thermal solutions and the positives of frame generation technology. Based on what they found from former insiders, this media manipulation stems from 3 people at the executive level. This is similar to what they found in 2020 when another review channel, Hardware Unboxed, was banned from receiving review samples because they weren't willing to emphasize ray tracing technology. So Gamers Nexus tried to contact someone high level, like the Vice President of Global GeForce Marketing at Nvidia, but this was ignored. Gamers Nexus also claimed to have spoken to various business partners of Nvidia over the years, and every one of them had been terrified of Nvidia's visceral reactions to innocuous things. Years ago, one such partner, EVGA, decided to cut partnership with Nvidia out of principle, despite these sales representing 80% of their revenue. And at this point, this is still an evolving story as Gamers Nexus opened an investigation calling for business partners to contact them. Then, in Hardware Unboxed reaction to Nvidia's threat, they point out that Nvidia is basically trying to deny Gamers Nexus from getting revenue through certain types of content. A smaller creator who will be more impacted financially is more likely to get strong-armed into pushing Nvidia's narrative. And decades ago, it was much easier for corporations like Nvidia to get favorable coverage in similar ways. But nowadays, independent media usually have diversified income streams from ads and supporter donations, which means that they don't have as much pressure from corporations. But if you watch those 2 videos, you might be wondering, what kind of dystopian reality are we living in where videos explaining corporate greed are also sponsored and filled with ads? Well, Hardware Unboxed points out that other corporations, such as their sponsors MSI and G-Skill, don't have restrictions on the criticisms of their products. And in most countries, direct sponsorships have to be disclosed, which makes Nvidia's tactics more insidious because it's hidden despite the financial implications. And in receiving criticisms, other companies also tend to be more receptive. Whereas Nvidia had the tendency to try to change the reviewer's opinion and say that the feedback was wrong. With that context, let's now understand the manipulation behind the 5000 series GPU. The 5060 model of entry-level GPU was particularly bad, firstly because Nvidia didn't coordinate a review launch date, which was always the norm. Like for example, 11 October 2022 was set for the 4090 model. And without this kind of coordination, whichever review video that comes out first will likely be the best performing video, even if it is heavily biased. Secondly, unlike previously, most reviewers didn't have early access to drivers that would allow the GPU to function, which means that they had to rush out reviews on the product launch date. Third, note I say most reviewers, because some media did have access to these drivers, namely the ones willing to publish previews with heavy restrictions, such as comparing the new 5060 with frame generation to the much older 2060 and 3060 without frame generation, meaning it's basically just an ad. It should be pretty obvious when you look at these unrealistic improvements. Fourth, the 5060's launch date coincides with Computex, one of the largest trade shows that media outlets will also attend. This means that reviewers were stuck between choosing to test the new cards or report on the trade show, or well, just lose sleep and review the GPU from the hotel room. Fifth, 5060 has three types. A normal 5060 with 8GB of VRAM, a slightly better 5060 Ti with 8GB, and an even better 5060 Ti with 16GB. So guess which was the only one Nvidia gave reviewers access? Well, it all seems to be a happy coincidence that everything lined up to only create positive reviews for the 5060 GPUs, or at least it would have been if reviewers didn't call them out. So, what did reviewers find? Testing from their hotel room because of Computex, Hardware Unboxed found that the 5060 performance looks fine, but in higher resolutions, textures that don't fit into the limited VRAM go missing. In their conclusion, they say it is a troubled product that is almost certainly going to age incredibly poorly. If it just had more VRAM, they could have recommended the product. They then compare it to older models, saying that Nvidia has been making the same product for the last 5 years. In another channel, testing on 1080p only, they found similar conclusions with the 5060 offering a performance improvement, but the limited VRAM means that some games like Indiana Jones would just crash. Sanity check one more review. VRAM is a limitation again after adjusting some settings. So here's the thing, the 5060 is likely to sell well anyway, just like the older entry-level 4060 it replaced. Those were still popular despite bad reviews. And these GPUs are going into pre-built PCs to be sold to people who won't know that the hardware doesn't have the longevity they might want due to the limited VRAM. But I also think that reviews tend to be a bit harsh as they usually only consider launch prices. And I guess in a way, it's to balance out the overly exaggerated marketing. But why is Nvidia limiting VRAM in the first place, right? The ongoing theory is that this segments the consumer and business markets so that the businesses can't just use cheaper consumer cards. For example, you don't really want your consumer level 4090 GPU with 24GB of VRAM to cannibalize your AI or data center GPUs with 40 or 80GB of VRAM. And even going down to entry level grade, the 4060 Ti with 16GB is known as a pretty good budget option for hobbyists due to the VRAM. Of course, businesses won't touch this because of the low speeds and time is money. But the point is that with this kind of segmentation, there's no such thing as a perfect GPU unless you are willing to fork out more money. You are always trading off either speed, VRAM, or money. Well, maybe in a few months we'll see what Gamers Nexus manages to uncover, but considering that there are no lawsuits, most likely this is just reputational damage. Aside from this, there were also the antitrust probes from the DOJ and China, but let's be honest, those are unlikely to have much impact on a company, especially one so tied with American exceptionalism. Even Intel managed to drag its antitrust case for more than a decade.